I might just begin with a couple of words about the methodology, if you like, for how we're going to conduct these sessions. We have 5 evenings together, and it's very much intended to be a conversation. We're going to read our way together through this encyclical. I'll be sending on, after tonight's session, I'll be sending on to Sylvia an outline of the 5 sessions, or the 5 weeks together, so that more or less for each session, I'll be asking you to read 1 chapter of Fratelli Tutti. In some cases, we'll have to deal with 2 chapters together. The final 2 chapters or sections of the document are very, very short, so we take those together, for example. But I'll send this on to Sylvia in due course, and she can pass it on to each of you. And it just indicates the relevant chapter for each evening. And that's just so that you guys can perhaps read that chapter in advance if you have time. There's no problem if you haven't got time and you can't get to it. We all have busy lives and we all have other responsibilities. So this isn't homework, and this isn't me going to be checking up on anyone and making sure everybody has it read. But it might just, I suppose, facilitate the conversation a little bit better if people could even just have a quick read over the chapter for that particular night. I suppose it will just make the conversation a little bit more interesting for everybody. So that single page with the outline will come to you in the next, probably tomorrow or whenever Sylvia can send that on. The sessions themselves, my thinking is to just give you an input at the start of each evening. So for maybe 20 minutes to half an hour. And then to allow for conversation and questions and answers and discussion to develop from that. There's no point in me giving you guys a lecture for an hour. That's going to be kind of stale and boring. And this is really an inclusive and a collaborative group. This is about all of us figuring our way through the encyclical together and learning from each other. So there needs to be sufficient time for you guys to offer your insights, or to ask questions, or to raise queries or criticisms about the document as we go along. But I suppose in order to just maybe get through enough of the content for any given evening, I'll just begin, I'll give my input, and then we carry on the conversation from there, okay? So that's how we'll, I suppose, conduct the sessions. For tonight's meeting, I'm going to look at the first 2 chapters of the document. So don't worry if some people haven't had a chance to look at it yet, or haven't perhaps read all of chapters 1 and 2. They serve quite conveniently as just a nice, gentle introduction. It helps us to, I suppose, get thinking and get talking about morality. It helps to set out the stall for what Pope Francis then does in much more detail as the encyclical goes on. So tonight's session is going to be more of a gentle introduction. I don't want to speak for too long, but then from next week onwards, we're going to be getting into more of the kind of the depth and the richness of this document. When Sylvia approached me about this a number of weeks ago, I thought this was a great idea to have a kind of a book club study group type occasion, because this is a very rich document. There's a lot in it. And I was speaking to some of my BD students in Maynooth when the encyclical was issued first. They asked me just to give a very brief talk on it, kind of a first reaction to the document. I only had read it very briefly. I think it had only been out a couple of days. And one of the things I said to them was that if they could get into little groups themselves of 2 or 3 people, since they all live together and, you know, study together and whatnot, and take it 1 chapter at a time, and only look at 1 chapter per week, and really try to think out and unpack and reflect upon what Pope Francis is saying in that particular chapter. Because when we actually pause and read the document slowly enough and let ourselves absorb the document, we actually realize just how much is in it. So when Sylvia came to me, I just thought this was a great idea and a great way of doing it. And it allows us the space to go slowly through the document and I suppose see the richness and see the depth of it. As some of you know from having looked at other papal encyclicals, popes tend not to write short encyclicals. For some reason, they seem to think long encyclicals are the way to go. And unfortunately, Fratelli Tutti is a long document also. It's a touch repetitive. And again, that's not an uncommon thing in encyclicals. So for that reason, it's also good that we're doing it bit by bit. If you were to sit down and start at the first sentence and try to read Fratelli Tutti in its entirety, you'd probably get bored or tired of it, or your mind would start wandering. So this is actually a really good way, I think, of approaching the document. So before I get into some of the key points in those first two chapters of Fratelli Tutti, there's just a couple of other general remarks I might make about the document. You don't have to agree with anything that I say. I'm not saying that I'm any kind of authority or that I'm right per se in what I'm saying. These are my own reflections and my own, I suppose, insights and comments on the document. The first thing that I noticed when the document came out first, and there were a lot of initial short pieces in things like the Tablet or in the National Catholic Reporter in America or America magazine, the Jesuit magazine in America. There were just, again, in those initial couple of days, a lot of short pieces that came out. And a lot of people, particularly, but not exclusively, women, noticed the title of the document and the masculine language used or captured in that title. And some were kind of critical of it. And why are we being called to kind of brotherhood and so on? And is this another example of a papal document that's using exclusive language? So, for example, referring to the rights of man, or men are created, or mankind, or so on and so forth. That's what I mean by exclusive language. To be fair, Pope Francis does in fact use inclusive language in the document itself. He refers to men and women as he goes along and as he talks about a particular issue. He deals with issues to do with women and women's vulnerability at various points in the document. So I wasn't terribly concerned about the title per se, although it was unfortunate and it was an easy thing to avoid. What was of greater concern to me was the lack of women's voices in the document. There are 292 sources cited in Fratelli Tutti, over something like 288 footnotes, something like that. And not one of those sources is a woman saint, a woman theologian, a woman political leader. It's all men. It's Martin Luther King, or it's Desmond Tutu, or it's Saint X, Y, and Z, all of whom are men. And again, it's just a little bit disappointing because Pope Francis, to be fair to him, during his pontificate, has always defended and spoken out about women's rights, about women's equality, and particularly vulnerable women in different parts of the world, poorer women, women at risk in different cultures and in different societies. So this has always been a strong part of what Francis has said and what he's about. So again, it's just something to note. It's not something I want to get hung up on, but it is, for me at least, a disappointing aspect of it. There are plenty of women he could have referred to, Dorothy Day or Elizabeth Johnson or Catherine Mary Lacuna, or any number of people in our tradition and outside of our tradition. And yet women don't seem to feature in his thinking here, at least. That said, I don't want that to sort of be a terribly negative marker on the document, because it is a really, really interesting document. And it's a document that when I read it, I get excited about. And every time I read it, I see something new in it. It very much speaks to the kinds of issues that I'm interested in. It speaks in a language and with a passion that I'm interested in and that I would echo. So overall, I think it's a really, really important and really excellent document. The final general thing I would say about it, and this is just my take on it, not everyone might agree with this. As I was reading it, it felt to me that there was a kind of a summative feel about this document. I'm not saying this is going to be the last encyclical that the Pope writes. He's probably going to write a number of different types of documents, and he may well write other encyclicals also. But when you look at Laudato Si or Evangelii Gaudium or Caridia Amazonia, here in Fratelli Tutti, he seems to pull together a lot of his thinking, a lot of the things we find in those documents also. So it is a little bit repetitive in that sense, but it's almost like he's trying to kind of hit home or punch home his thinking, his ideas, the stuff he's interested in, the things he's passionate about. And that's just something that came across to me. I could be very, very wrong about that. But there is that sense that he's trying to pull all of these other documents together here in Fratelli Tutti in one way or another. So let's just have a quick look then at some of the key points in the first two chapters of this papal encyclical. The context for this document, as Pope Francis mentions early on, is partly the COVID pandemic. It'd be very difficult for him to write this and not mention COVID. It seems to be the only topic on everyone's lips at the moment. But I suppose COVID has raised a lot of different concerns for us as human beings all around the world. It has provided a lens, if you like, through which we can evaluate and identify various global problems. So, for example, it was one of the ways in which we had renewed conversations about the environment. We started to see the canals of Venice cleaned and dolphins returning and all of this kind of thing. It has allowed us to think about and discuss our economics, how we do economics, how economies have become so dependent on consumption. And this is one of the things that Francis talks about here. I'll come to it in a minute, and elsewhere also. It has made us reevaluate how we interact, how we communicate, how we travel, why do we travel. It has made us reevaluate the strength or the weaknesses of our health systems, how we care for the vulnerable and the elderly among us, who we identify as vulnerable among us, and so on and so forth. So COVID is one of the reasons, if you like, this document has come out. But like all papal documents, you could say, papal encyclicals, Francis is here addressing the signs of the times. So he wants to deal with issues of globalization and migration and economics and poverty and inequality and war and violence and the death penalty and so on. And these are things he'd be dealing with whether or not COVID had come along. Okay, so this is a document that addresses the signs of the times, and Francis, again, in like his other social documents, he's not skirting around anything. He's getting directly to the point. He's calling us out. He's demanding more of us. He's demanding us to convert in terms of how we think and how we live, as well as to convert or reform our global structures and so on. So he talks about the false securities that COVID has highlighted and raised, and how we had up to now, I suppose, taken so much for granted, both locally and globally. COVID has made us reevaluate all of these things. And in the course of the document, he kind of weaves that in and out as we go along. We'll see that over the next coming weeks. One of the, I suppose, most important issues that he raises in this first chapter is what he describes as aggressive nationalism. Now, we'll be dedicating an evening a little later on to the question of politics and so on, and this is all related, obviously. But he's very strong in what he says in his condemnation of this rise of aggressive nationalism. We've seen it in England, we've seen it in the United States under Trump, we've seen it in various parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, in Germany, in France. We see it in Australia, we see it in Brazil. The far right is popping up, and it's something we need to take seriously. And it's a deep concern of Francis, because he takes the example of people at borders, migrants, and the rise of xenophobia across our world. And he says that these populist regimes, built, as he says, on liberal economic approaches, dictate how migrants should be dealt with, and above all, how we ought to keep migrants out at all costs. So these populist regimes draw from a loss of a sense of identity among people. He says we need to regain a sense of history. We need to regain a sense of who we are. That loss of sense of history and identity plays into the far right. These ideologies, he says, are key to how the youth get sucked in. Young people looking for some sense of identity and cause get sucked into these kinds of ideologies and regimes. So this is a very real danger. It's not too far from our shores and from where we live and our communities. This sense of who belongs, who counts, who do we have any responsibility towards, who should we exclude and for what reason? These are all questions that we need to be constantly thinking about. And for Francis, there's an interesting piece in paragraph 14, which you can read in your own time. He says that the importance of historical consciousness is dependent on critical thinking. We must become critical thinkers, that we don't just listen to what we want to hear, or we don't just listen to the popular thing, that we remain critical in our thinking. And that goes for all walks of life. And I think that's more important now than ever. He offers also in this first chapter a very brief sense of his thinking, let's say, on political life. And again, we'll look at this in more detail later on. But if you take, for example, paragraph 15 of Fratelli Tutti, we get a flavor of what Francis has to say and what he's about. He says, political life no longer has to do with healthy debates about long-term plans to improve people's lives and to advance the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques, primarily aimed at discrediting others. In this craven exchange of charges and countercharges, debate degenerates into a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. Now, I'm not saying that he wrote this document with the former President Trump in mind, but it's very hard to read some of these sections and not think of leadership such as Trump, for example, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. Shortly after the document was issued, I joined a conversation in Boston College. So it was made up of American, US moral theologians. And it was really interesting to get their response to this. They were more or less suggesting he was writing this with President Trump in mind. Now, nobody knows, and that may be a stretch. But when you look at what he has to say about political life, the role of politics, that politics is there to serve the common good, versus the kind of politics that we're seeing emerge nowadays, you see that there's quite a gulf between where we should be at in our political life and the realities that we're seeing in various parts of the world. So again, these are things we'll explore at a later time. The other thing that I just want to say about chapter 1 is that he goes back to a familiar theme, something that he discusses in Laudato Si, in Evangelii Gaudium. And this is the danger of what he describes as limitless consumption and empty individualism. He refers again to a throwaway world, or a throwaway culture is what he calls it in Laudato Si. And again, this is something he's warning us against. Our economics is terribly dependent on this. If you think of the global economic crash of 2008 and the situation that Ireland was in 2008 and following, one of the things that I heard regularly from politicians was the need for people to go back out into society and start spending. Because once we start spending, we get the economy going again. If your economy is dependent upon people spending, or in other words, upon people consuming, right, we're in difficulty. Because we know that consumption and production are two of the key issues affecting a sustainable world, affecting ecology and the environment. So without explicitly sort of getting into that issue here, we can hear echoes of Laudato Si in what Francis is calling for here. And the other interesting thing is that it also echoes his earlier documents, where he talks about not just our reforming structures. So we do our economics differently, for example, or we reform our health system, or whatever it might be. The reforming of structures may be necessary for our to build a more inclusive and a more fraternal society, but we need inner conversion also. People themselves need to change. We all need to change how we think and how we see. So there's the threefold, I suppose, connection between production, consumption, and lifestyle. We need a change of lifestyle. We need a change of heart, a metanoia, that great Greek word. We need to do things differently, and we need to live differently. So it's not just about kind of the external. You fix the structure and that's the problem dealt with. For Francis, at the heart of all of this is a deep human crisis. And if we don't deal with the human person, we're not going to solve the issues at hand. So Christian anthropology is constantly here in the background of what Francis is saying. He's constantly coming back to the human person, the call to conversion, and so on. So that's really important. He deals with a lot of other stuff in this first chapter, albeit briefly. As I said, this first chapter offers us a kind of a taster for what's to come in the document. He deals with economics, or he mentions it, economics, poverty, and inequality. He talks about today's injustices, such as violence and terrorism, the vulnerability of women in many parts of the world, and the issue of slavery, which I thought was quite interesting. And we know that slavery comes in many forms. And we know also, unfortunately, that there are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the slave trade to America. So it's interesting that he names that here in this first chapter. The final point I'll just make about this chapter before I say something very briefly about chapter 2, and then we can open it up for discussion, is he talks also about the illusion of communication, which is really interesting. He has a lot of great phrases in this document. And again, we've been hearing a lot about fake news over the last number of months and years. He refers to digital campaigns of hatred and destruction, the ways in which social media, as well as print and TV and all these other things, can fuel and spread hatred, xenophobia, all of the different phobias that exclude and condemn and marginalize people. He says information without wisdom is a problem. Okay, we all have information. We have Google on our phones. We can get information on anything, anytime. But information without wisdom is problematic. And he says, in order to have wisdom, he says, wisdom demands an encounter with reality. So we're back to critical thinking. We're back to being people of openness, open-mindedness, intelligent individuals in the broadest sense of the word. that we're willing to open our minds to new ideas, to new ways of thinking, and to have the, I suppose, the skills, the prudence to see things for what they are. There's a couple of just brief points I'll make about the second chapter, and then I'll leave it at that and let you guys have a discussion about this. The second chapter is a really interesting one, and I was so glad to see it in the Encyclical. I was surprised. I wasn't expecting chapter 2 to be here. And the chapter is called A Stranger on the Road, and it's where he deals with the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we all know very well. The reason I really like the fact that this is included is partly because I start my Catholic Social Doctrine module of my BDs with this parable, because I think it's a really useful parable for getting us to think about the call to be moral. The obvious question that it raises for us is, who is our neighbor? And we tend to think that this is the kind of the moral message that Jesus is trying to put across here. And of course it is. He's asking us to think outside the categories that we have constructed for each other. Human beings have become very good at creating categories for each other. You're black or you're white, you're a man or you're a woman, you're gay or you're straight, you're Muslim or you're Christian, or whatever it is. And we categorize people and we leave them in those categories. And very often those categories determine whether that person counts or doesn't count in society. So it is about seeing beyond stereotypes and caricatures and categories, be they religious or cultural or whatever, and actually seeing the person behind those categories. The Irish theologian Donald Harrington has a lovely phrase when he talks about this parable and indeed the entire, I suppose, ethic of Jesus in the New Testament. And he says Jesus was more concerned about people than about principles. It doesn't matter. The parable tells us that it doesn't matter about religious rituals, religious protocol that tell you you're not allowed to touch this person. What you should be seeing is a person in need. But there's, I suppose, deeper moral messages to this parable as well. The first is, who is my neighbor? And we have to answer that question. The second is kind of, who is the hero? And we tend to think that the Good Samaritan is the hero because he was the one who stopped and came to the assistance of the person beaten up and left for dead on the road. And we tend to think of ourselves as being like the Good Samaritan. This is the person we'd like to be. We don't want to be the people who walked on, and we condemn them and perhaps we even judge them for having walked on. But morality tells us that we're not either virtuous or vicious because of one thing, be it good or bad, that we have done. The Good Samaritan might have been a pretty awful person. We don't know anything about the Good Samaritan, only that he stopped at this moment on that road to help somebody who was in need. Now, that's a good thing to have done. But in other respects, that person might have been pretty awful. He might have been a bad husband, or he may not have paid his taxes, or he might have been a bad employer, or whatever. We don't know. But we're judging the entirety of his life on that single action. We're also judging the entirety of the people walking on the basis that they failed to stop. And we forget the ways in which we are all conditioned and that we are all influenced and biased. Peer pressure might prevent us from acting or reacting well at a particular moment. Cultural norms, religious norms might dictate that we don't act as we should at a particular moment. But we're not, I suppose, doomed for it. And those who walked on and who failed to stop, we can be critical of that action, but we don't condemn them based solely on that, on the entirety of that one action. So morality is about a journey. And although we fail to do what we should at times, it doesn't mean that we're not that we're irredeemable or anything like that. The other thing that the parable tells us is that our moral response is very often determined by our capacity at a given moment. The Good Samaritan stopped and he did a lot for that person. He had bandages and oils, for example. which meant he was a person of wealth. He paid the innkeeper, which meant he was a person of wealth. Not all of us, if we encounter this person on the side of the road, might be able to do the same thing. We may not have the same means or the same resources, but we do what we can in any given moment. Francis here in this document has a wonderful sentence when he's reflecting on this parable. And he said, the Good Samaritan, it's not just about the things he gave the person on the side of the road. It's about the time he gave the person on the side of the road. It's about encounter. And the fact that he stopped at all is the critical thing. And I suppose that's part of the message that is there for us in terms of what we encounter, what's in front of us. We all haven't got the same capacities or the same resources, but it's about doing what you can, when you can, in a given situation. And the final moral message we might take from this parable is that we don't, I suppose, take upon ourselves the burden of morality, of global morality, so to speak. The Good Samaritan didn't change the world. That road, for biblical scholars who know it, was a very dangerous road, and people were beaten up and robbed on a regular basis. That world was a violent world, and it remained violent. And the Good Samaritan doesn't change any of that through his actions. Okay? But what he does is he changes the world of the person that he encountered. So that we don't put upon our shoulders the burden of having to change the world. Very few of us become Mother Teresa or, Martin Luther King. So we don't take upon ourselves that burden, but we take upon ourselves the responsibility of changing the world of the people we encounter, no matter who they are, no matter their creed or their gender or anything else. And that's the message I think that ultimately Jesus is trying to bring across in that parable. Much of that is going to come out later in the Encyclical as we go through it. The issues that Francis deals with in Fratelli Tutti are incredibly complicated, incredibly complex global problems that will not be solved today or tomorrow. We can either feel overwhelmed by it and take upon ourselves the entirety of the magnitude and the burden of those problems, or we can say to ourselves, we do what we can when we can, through authentic encounter with those around us. So I suppose that parable helps us to kind of keep in perspective what Francis is saying, while also providing us with a challenge to see differently, to act differently, to encounter differently.